Hello and welcome to History Respawned. I'm John Harney and I'm joined by Bob. Hey Bob.
Hey, John.
We are going to play a little bit of Ghost of Tsushima, which is it's kind of historic in its own way. It's one of the last PS4 exclusives. Pour one out and so on. Where Ghost of Tsushima is set around the first Mongol invasion of Japan in 1274, and well, I can talk about it more. Um, First, I'll say this is a good game, and as you can probably see, it is beautiful. Bob,
Get
what do you
a little
think?
rain coming in here. Yeah, it looks gorgeous. This is the first I've seen of it. I had purposely avoided most of the coverage of this game simply because I knew we would be doing this episode of History Respawn. So I'm really excited to see this. And like you said, it's one of the last PS4 games, which I think is sad. But at the same time, this game looks like it benefits from being one of the last PS4 games. You can tell that the developers have really
Yeah,
made the most of this hardware.
I mean, completely. Like this is, when a console's about to launch and they show you all the fever dreams, usually a Final Fantasy VII remake, which they actually ended up doing, kind of. But this is really it. And it's funny because I had come to this point earlier, and I turned off my PlayStation, and there were two farmers here, one of whom had a little question bubble over their head, which is how you start a little mini side quest type thing. And now
Hmm.
they're gone, and I guess they're adhering to the day-night cycle, which is a cool thing.
Awesome.
Here's my horse Nobu, and let's just ride around it. So very quickly, the game it's an open world game, and it's kind of it's an interesting mix of pretty kind of standard open, like there's a lot of what's the term they use? There's a lot of kind of making your life easier type things in this game. So, for example,
Okay.
let's go to the menu here, and everything it's very video gamey. You've got a nice map with the kind of major quests highlighted, and as you can see, it shows you'll get a major legend increase from going to the Broken Blacksmith. This is part of Jin's journey, which is effectively the main story. Over here we have again Jin's journey, and you get an increase to your legend, which is basically your leveling up, and you
Wow.
see
So
a
it really
specific
makes it
thing.
clear
Oh yeah,
straight
yeah,
up as to what you're going to get out of this. That's
exactly.
pretty nice.
Yeah, and it is, and it's the kind of thing you can see why games typically used to kind of hide this kind of stuff, but it's nice to have it there. We'll go to the Golden Temple in a minute, and I'll show you what that's like. But it's basically it's a hub, where as you can see, you have the gift altar. People are leaving stuff for your character, and you can do the various upgrades there. And you just kind of you just go around. You have the Mythic Tales, which I just opened up, and I haven't played a lot of the game, as you can probably see from the map, right? You can see I've kind of been riding through the island, but
Hmm.
at the same time, there's already plenty to do, um, and so it's kind of very good at kind of keeping you busy in that way. So
Yeah.
here's a place I haven't been to yet, and you swipe up on the thumb pad, and the wind blows in the direction you're supposed to be going, which is around the corner here.
Neat.
Yeah, and it works, works kind of nicely. I might have gone a
So,
bit too high. Yeah.
so is the setting of the game, is it completely on the island of Tsushima, or does it include other parts? What's the
So
story
far,
there?
it's completely on kind of Tsushima's kind of an island kind of group on the southeast corner of Japan, southwest corner of Japan, and I don't think we're going to be leaving Tsushima in this game.
Okay.
I think partly because the setup of the game the game world is already kind of large, and even the setup of the game, I'd be very surprised. Let's get onto the beach here. If I ended up going back to, well, I was going to say mainland Japan, but that's part of what's interesting with Tsushima. So Tsushima is on the southwest corner of Japan. It's very close to Korea. The Koreans had kind of traditionally claimed it. I think there's a city in the southeast of Korea that still technically claims Tsushima to be Korean, but the Korean government, for the most part, kind of has let it go. It's a claim that doesn't really get brought up unless people are already annoyed with each other, kind of thing.
Hmm.
But in the game, it's very much Japan, and this is the invasion of Japan, and everyone is Japanese, and there are no Koreans, and there's no, at least so far, there is zero acknowledgement of Koreans existing. Oh, okay, I better get out of here. Overwhelming enemy
Overwhelming enemy
forces.
force. Ooh.
Another example of the game being very, very not shy about, hey, this is a game. We're not ready for you to come here yet. and we'll
Yeah.
just hang out here on this beautiful beach for a few minutes. In fact, let me
Well, and I
take a.
noticed.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I noticed too that it had like it seemed like a stealth meter, detection meter that came up
Yes,
once you were.
exactly. And that happens with wild animals as well, and it's just kind of a key way if you want to avoid combat. Um, I like taking cool shots of my back to the camera. Here we go. And you enter camera mode with pressing right on the D-pad, and you can do all these things. And you can also add music. If you want to create like an interactive kind of little waiting screen
Oh,
here.
yeah.
You can put the stamp on it. Cinema bars. On top
Cinema
of that in a
bars.
minute. He doesn't have a helmet
Oh,
right
change the
now.
hairstyle. Okay.
Jin's
Wow.
emotion, which I haven't done yet. So as you can see, he's a man of many emotions. This kind of a rather taciturn fellow. Um, you can do a still screenshot, and they're very proud of this, and I think they're correct to be proud of it.
Hmm.
The game is gorgeous, and the game really conveys Japan in a way that you see Japanese kind of art and popular culture over the years convey Japan. You know what I mean? It's kind of conveying all the classic kind of elements of the environment and everything else. So it's kind of, and so the game in its spirit, the game celebrates a very specific way of looking at Japan, if that makes sense.
Hmm.
And Tsushima, like so I was saying a few minutes ago, Tsushima for centuries and centuries and centuries was a really important place in terms of trade between Korea and Japan. And in fact, trade between Korea and Japan and cultural exchange, religious exchange, political models, like a lot of very important components in Japanese culture, even as early as the medieval period. In fact, for centuries before the medieval period, had really probably come through Korea and basically through Tsushima. And so far in the game, there's zero acknowledgement of that whatsoever,
Oh,
um,
wow.
which doesn't really surprise me because the kind of more traditional Japanese historiographies don't really do that either.
Right.
It's just not something that's really kind of discussed or talked about. So, for example, theoretically, in fact, we know that a lot of the Mongol forces in 1224 were actually Korean troops, and the game, at least so far, hasn't kind of nodded towards that. But then there's lots of reasons you wouldn't in 2020. You wouldn't want to kind of embrace a potential Korean-Japanese issue. So let's take advantage
Right.
of some cannot fast travel during combat. Okay, so there's another example of being very video gaming. I didn't think I was in combat. Apparently, I am. So let's call Nobu on the run here. There's none of this finding my horse 6 feet away nonsense. He'll probably show up. Well, he usually does. Come on, Nabu. Maybe he's fighting them. In true video game fashion, I'm just running away so that I can fast travel. So I can fast travel
So
somewhere.
what's the story with the setting? Because my knowledge of Japanese history basically covers from 1850 to the present, and I know
Right.
nothing about 13th century Japan. So
Sure.
what's going on here with this invasion?
Okay, that's a great question. The Mongols attempted to invade Japan twice in 1274 and 1281. This game is set in a kind of an edited or altered version of the first attempted invasion, and neither invasion worked. So this is a kind of a temple
It's
area. And
gorgeous.
so it's beautiful, and you see all the. So here, who is this over here? This is a bowyer, or bowyer, I suppose. It loves kicking these little mini cutscenes because they love it. In fairness, I think this is the first time I've talked to her, which is why she's doing all this.
Gotcha.
So if
But
I
it's
want to
great.
up,
It's an in-engine cutscene tee. It looks great.
yeah, oh yeah, exactly. And so you see here, it's all fairly simple. Supplies are just a random thing you're picking up, and I'll just let her do it. That's how you upgrade. So the Mongols, as many people watching will know, of course, one of the great land empires in the history of the world. He's a great example of conquest. And in 1234, they began in earnest in 1234, they began in earnest their invasion. The northern part of China fell. And the rest of China falls in 1279, so about 5 years after the setting of this particular game.
Hmm.
Genghis Khan died in China, actually, in the midst of kind of crushing China. And the Mongols were their usual vicious terrifying selves, basically. All through northern China. They defeated Korea, and all the Koreans did fight back, and there was a lot of war between the Mongols and the Koreans. The Koreans are effectively made a vassal state, and they don't. I mean, that was the right move for the Koreans because the Mongols were so intimidating and so overpowering,
Hmm.
and so they turned their attention to Japan, and they really wanted to make Japan. At this point, China is ruled by Kublai Khan, the grandson of Genghis Khan. And after Genghis Khan died, the great land empire was split into all the different relatives, basically. So you had the Golden
Hmm.
Horde up in Russia, you had the Khanate down in kind of what is now known as the Middle East, at least in the West, and over here in China, Japan, Korea, you have Kublai Khan's Yuan dynasty, which is basically a Chinese-style dynasty run by the Mongols. And he was determined to conquer Japan. So in 74 he attempted and they failed. In 81 they attempted and they failed. And he wanted to do it again, but basically his advisors successfully talked him out of it until he died in 1294. So Japanese history about this period is really interesting. The second invasion, notoriously for the Mongols, ended because of a divine wind that struck down their fleet in the ocean. And of course, the Mongols were known for other things, but sailing wasn't one of them. And that wind, a divine wind, or in Japanese, kamikaze, or kamikaze as we know it now, has gone into Japanese folklore. And in the first invasion, which is this, what happened in the end was the Japanese were effectively defeated by the Mongolians, but they kind of held them off, and in particular injured one of their important leaders, and the Mongols decided to return somewhere
Hmm.
between a retreat and a tactical. It was messy basically, and there's the
Pyrrhic victory.
yeah, and the primary sources from the time talk about the samurai, being too noble, and the Japanese primary sources and taking on the Mongols, wanting to take them on one, which is not. We can talk about that too, because this notion of how much Jin Sakai, the central character, is abandoning a samurai code so far in the game is a huge part of the game, and is it's a bit oversimplifies it. But here's a woman. So this is kind of a you have the side quests where you meet a random person who just like this guy over here, for example. We can do him first. So this guy,
Hmm.
I'm going to be able to help this person in some way, and it kicks off a small little quest. And we come back to her, and she is a character that I have recruited to my cause to rescue my lord, who was captured at the beginning of the game, and she kind of has a chain of quests. And then you have the Jin's journey quest. You have all these different branching things. So let's talk to this
Gotcha.
guy.
Have you seen the birds, Lord Sakai? What birds are you looking for? The golden ones. Songs that remind you of more peaceful times.
My mother's favorite. She used to say they knew our island better than any other creature.
I believe it, my lord. If it weren't so dangerous, I'd follow one. See where the golden bird leads me.
Maybe I'll do just that. You should
Well,
wait
that
until
sounds like a
morning so you
collectible.
once more.
Exactly. So
Thank you.
I found a couple of these, and basically they lead you to shrines and things. Oh, so he was just telling me stuff. Okay, so he was basically that was a mini gameplay tutorial. But
Hmm.
what's been quite common is I'd go up to a guy like that and say hello, and he'd say, "Oh, please help me, please come and do this," and I would run off. And it's almost for people who play massively multiplayer online games, it's almost like an instant event where I mean I think I can abandon the little quest, but the idea is like, hey, you're doing this now. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like it's not over here for you to do. Like you're doing this now. So let's go and talk to her. And that quest or that cutscene you saw, they all do that. They cut out these little tracking angles and stuff, and they're going for the cinematic vibe really all the time through the game.
Families kill us.
On the list we found, Sada was at the top. He's the head man of Kuta Farmstead.
Kuta's people served your clan. Why would he turn against you?
Because he is an ungrateful traitor. My husband appointed
So she's a
Sada
great
as leader,
character
and he
so
requited
far.
kindness with bloodshed.
But you see all this honor versus treason dichotomy they're kind of talking about.
You survived.
One of the things that fascinates me is how the game completely ignores class. In that the samurai are these benevolent people who are in charge, and everyone who isn't a samurai either accepts that or is an insidious traitor. Um, and certainly, if you were a samurai walking around in the 1270s, there's not many peasants who are going to like say things to your face about how they don't like you or whatever. But also, being a samurai at this point meant that you were pretty well off and in control of the political structure. So about a century before this, you had these very famous rebellions in the 12th century between people contending to control the imperial throne, who had their different samurai clans coming in to represent them. And it's a very long story, but over the following 40, 50 years, going into the 1180s, samurai became much more heavily invested in the political infrastructure of the country. And they don't replace an existing noble class, but they kind of join an existing noble class. So at this point, Jin Sakai, yes, he's a samurai and he's a warrior and everything, but he's also, he's the guy who's coming to collect the taxes, and he or his peers are the ones settling legal disputes over property and all that kind of stuff as well.
So he's warrior class, but also bureaucrat.
Yeah, exactly. And this is, over the course of decades, of course, this is a transition that's happening. It's fairly mature at this point. But we're still in the golden age of samurai, where samurai are actually fighting and things. So much of what we know about samurai is defined by these books that were produced in the 1700s and 1800s that really, at a time where the samurai were just kind of, as a warrior class, no longer actually existed, and were now purely a privileged socioeconomic group. But this is the golden era in many ways, of which those classics speak, and the whole idea of the samurai, the first thing in the samurai's life must be death, and his loyalty to his lord must be absolute, and all these kinds of idealized, honorific kind of concepts are all based on this period. And this game so far really dives into that. Oh, okay. I'm sorry, everyone. I wasn't paying attention. I was explaining 12th and 13th century Japanese politics.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wasn't paying attention at all. Okay. But now you see, so the game is pretty forgiving. So,
Yeah.
So we're gonna so for example, the game has some stealth elements, and it actually feels a lot like a kind of a Assassin's Creed prior to Origins. Sometimes,
Oh boy,
kind of where Assassin's Creed was going, in the sense like you're doing a good old fashioned Assassin's Creed assassinate from on high type thing. And the first time he did it, Jin had a flashback to his mentor, who's currently been captured by the bad guy, and he's agonizing over breaking his code and everything else, because a samurai would never kill a man without looking in his eyes first and all that kind of stuff. But when the samurai first came in about a century earlier into politics in a meaningful way, I mean, one of the reasons they were so effective is they filled the streets of Kyoto, the imperial capital, with blood. They would decapitate their enemies and walk around with these skulls swinging from their waistbands. So they weren't, the reality of medieval battle was pretty rough. So the and in fact. One of the most famous kind of literary classics of this period is the Tale of the Heiku, which documents these 12th century kind of conflicts. And these guys they're pretty pragmatic, because they don't want to die. So, they definitely care about honor, and losing face is a huge deal. And ritual suicide on the battlefield is happening in the classic, but they're not
too good to use alternative tactics, as we might say.
It happens, but if interestingly enough, maybe they'll do the alternative tactics, but then they will weep about it and mourn, but they're not moping. Like Jin Sakai is a bit of a moper so far. But we'll see. We'll see where it goes.
It's not the same thing, but it reminds me so much of misconceptions about medieval Europe and chivalry.
Right.
And
yes.
These guys were not heroic, altruistic figures, and they were not above using dirty tricks to defeat somebody. And,
right.
It sounds like it's kind of a similar story here.
Well, it's fascinating as well, because if you look at the English language sources discussing samurai in the 19th century, going even as late as the early 20th century, they would often, rather than use the word samurai, they'd often be described as knights, Knight, from the medieval period. And there was this sense, both amongst Western observers and then Japanese historians who kind of were, familiarizing themselves with Western historiography. There was a similarity seen between the samurai and the knights, and this idea of chivalry, and a chivalric code and everything. And there's no question that honor and there's no question that they would operate in ways that maybe wouldn't quote unquote make sense outside of the importance of honor as a currency and everything else, you know.
Hmm.
And ritual suicide definitely happened. Um, but yeah, at the end of the day, you know, you're taking out, you know, a sharp object and stabbing somebody with it. Like, this is a really messy, horrible business.
Yeah.
You know, and going back to the Mongol invasions, for example, as you know, Bob, one of the classic issues with medieval historiography is the difficulty in figuring out how many people actually were at such and such a battle. You know, this
Hmm.
is a classic problem in medieval historiography in Europe, and it's the exact same thing with the Mongol invasions, because both the Mongolian and the Japanese sides give these massive, massive numbers, and it's very
Right.
hard to
Yeah.
know. And then you know, there's an investment on the Japanese side in kind of showing they were outnumbered against impossible odds, and that might not have been true. The Mongols certainly didn't say that, but then again, they wouldn't, would they? You know, they wouldn't want to advertise the fact they'd been beaten by a smaller number. So,
What
Yeah.
coincidences?
Oh, there's so much of that in, Western history, and you can think back to
We'll soon find out.
thinking more recently of another game, Assassin's Creed Odyssey, and the so-called 300 Spartans, and there's
right,
some belief that the 300 Spartans is probably accurate, but the tens of thousands of Persian soldiers that they fought was probably a slight embellishment.
right. Um, this is where I'm talking and playing, and two, I haven't quite got the hang of this game yet.
Combat.
I'm kind of getting there, and I can see how it's going to be fun when I do get there. Oh, but you see, it really wants you to. So, for
It looks like
example,
it's giving you a parry opportunity.
yes, it is, except when when you see the red dot, that is not parryable. At least not. I probably can do it with an update
Oh,
soon,
really?
but
Ah,
but I'm kind of supposed to dodge. I would love a Dark Souls type lock on, which I don't currently have.
also you might get an upgrade that allows you to do that.
Yeah, so for example, there's an upgrade I haven't taken yet, which would allow me to parry any sword, so like including some pretty big guys, which I currently can't always do. Oh, so you see, that guy had both. He had parryable and he had. I'll try and parry to show it. Come on. It would help if I did it right. He got me with the third one, the jerk. But I'm starting to get the hang of it, and what it can be nice about the game is, and this goes into the kind of cinematic vibe as well. I had a side mission I was playing last night at a sake production facility where the Mongols are showing up and drinking all the sake. And so, you know, you're supposed to help. And it's one of these missions where, you know, it kind of says, go and hide. So basically, it gets to choose a time of day and everything. You're going to be there. And I don't know how to get up there to that guy. So it was kind of, you know, the sun was setting and I was fighting like 6, 7, 8 people at once. And it just looked beautiful. You know, it's going
Yeah.
to be in the episode. And then when you're getting into the flow of oh, she took care of him. When you're getting into the
Oh,
flow
nice.
of taking all these guys at once, it actually, I'm starting to see how it's a really enjoyable game.
Yeah, the lighting effects are really spectacular here, and
Yes.
I would say I also, not that I am really into gore or anything like that, but I did appreciate the animations they had for the enemy deaths. I thought that felt or looked realistic, to the extent that you would want it to for a game.
Right. And it
It
has,
looks it
yeah,
looks nice in the worst way possible.
yeah, and you'll have guys flailing, kind of. They're clearly down for the count, but they're not dead yet. And you can finish them off to be merciful and all these like little touches.
Corpses can't answer questions.
There's someone in the house. I'll make them talk.
Let me try first.
So yeah, and I've seen kind of people on Twitter and stuff complaining the game's very po-faced and everything, and that's been my experience so far. Jin Sakai is very straight-laced and everything, but I'm willing to give it time. There's hints that there might be more to it, you know.
The guards.
Hmm.
Doesn't say where he's hiding.
So I'm not sure, you know, how it's all going to go.
I'm not going to hurt you.
You're lying.
She'll help us. She can't stay here.
Take her to my estate. She is going to kill me.
No harm will come to you.
So you can see the game leans very hard into this kind of paternalistic government structure. Sorry to
Right.
sound like such an academic, but it does, you know.
Well, it seems like, there's a number of things. I mean, obviously, this is a game created by Western developers, but they are working for Sony, so I'm sure that they had a lot of influence from Japanese developers and Japanese studio heads in creating this game. But I
Yeah,
think it's really fascinating the way that you tell the story of the invasion, and then also how that combines with the story of the samurai. It seems like, again, I don't really know Japanese history, but it seems like these are two kind of key pillars in what you might call a nationalist history of Japan, as the samurai, and then also this threat of invasion and repelling outsiders, which is typical for any modern society to have that kind of national myth as a pillar,
right.
as fending off the other, fending off invaders. So, I could see where this game might lead to a lot of, I guess I would say, kind of restraint on the part of the developers, not really wanting to tip the boat too much, because I think this would be a story that would probably be near and dear to the hearts of many people at Sony and many players of this game.
Right, and we brought up the knights earlier, but it's just, there's a reason you have these romanticized versions of things because they're appealing to people and they can serve really useful functions in thinking
Hmm.
about kind of Japanese culture. And there's this fascinating element, and Japan's not unique in this either, where this kind of
Yes.
medieval period or quote unquote pre-modern period is theoretically frozen in time and idealized as a
Hmm.
reference point for a cultural identity, which certainly if you look at Japan in the early 20th century, for example, is seen as completely divorced from you know an industrial power driven universal education fueled type modern citizenship. So there's this, oh,
Hmm.
this is how it was in ye old times, but then the subtext is always there, like Japanese have never been conquered, Japanese resilience against hostile forces, all that kind of stuff.
Any supplies in the area?
And the honor of the samurai, meaning that the Japanese people themselves, the samurai are avatars for what ideal Japanese qualities are supposed to be, whether
Exactly.
that's being good, and also like very specific visions of, for example, Japanese masculinity, as
Yes.
well. Like this is now we just had a sidekick and she was a female character, and at this time in Japanese history, Japanese female samurai would have been way more common than they would be, for example, by the 1800s, where they were virtually non-existent.
Hmm.
But still, certainly the way the samurai has been spoken about in the years since and would be today is very fits into these. There's something very, the classic stoic, John Wayne style. The Americans have John Wayne, the British have the stiff upper lip. All these different ways that a kind of a masculine ideal is celebrated. But again, I'm sorry to repeat myself. You can see how ridiculously beautiful this game is. Um, the other thing I would say as well, there's the developers, and I know they went to Japan as part of this. There's a lot of the voice talent is clearly Japanese. There's a lot of interesting kind of little elements to it that kind of feel true for people who've been to Japan or read Japanese media and stuff. But um, I think what's interesting is they've used as a reference point um, uh, the most famous film director certainly from Japan ever. Help me out here, Bob. I can't remember his super famous name.
Kurosawa.
Thank you, Kurosawa. They have Kurosawa mode in the game and everything. But if you go and kind of watch Kurosawa samurai movies, the samurai, especially in things like Yojimbo, the samurai were weirdos. Like they were kind of
Well, and that's one of the things
and
that
he was
interests
quite
me.
acerbic towards them.
Yeah, and I took some film classes in college and undergrad, and it always seemed to me, ooh, wow.
This is the standoff mode, which is great fun. And I
Oh,
currently have an upgrade to take out two of them, and now I have to fight the
wow.
rest. That is it's fun.
These are Mongols here.
Yes, they're just roaming the land, I guess.
But one of the things that you mentioned Kurosawa is, he always gets brought up with regard to our perception of the samurai. But I had always learned that Kurosawa was always somewhat dismissive
Oh
of the
shoot.
samurai, and you can see in the way that he portrays them in the films that they're often seen as like you said, as like Yojimbo is a
Yeah.
murderous thug. It's not somebody that you would really valorize.
Yeah, and
Yeah, so
Toshiro Mifune, the famous Japanese actor who was kind of the go-to for Kurosawa to be the samurai. He always played the character as just kind of a weirdo, He's very strange, antisocial, and part of it was he was playing these Ronin characters that was kind of built in.
yes,
But one of the really interesting Kurosawa movies, it's not really one of his best. It's called Ran, which is in Japanese means kind of chaos, and it's actually it's effectively a samurai story interpretation of King Lear. And in the same way that King Lear, the Shakespeare play, is making a lot of comments about power and the kind of an arrogance and kind of this stupidity in particular in Lear's shape, on Lear's behalf. Ran is doing that too. And I don't think the samurai class escapes criticism there.
right.
So I wouldn't want to be too hard on them because I think that like like part of it is like the difficulty difficulty modes have kind of cute names that are inspired by this idea as well. So it's not. I feel a little bit bad that some people have been frustrated by their use of the Kurosawa mode and. I don't know. I guess what I'm trying to say is that kind of I don't know that it was meant to be as pretentious as some people could feel it is. And maybe I'm wrong, but I just that's not the impression I got. I'm totally going to die here.
Yeah,
My
this guy seems like
yeah, my empathy for the giant bomb guys and other people who try to talk while playing games is now huge. So, and he's gonna take me out here. There we go. So anyway, Kurosawa did a lot of that, but again, it's really just an aesthetic. So for example, let's turn it on right now. No, that's gameplay, John. Display.
Kurosawa mode.
You see it.
Oh wow,
Kind
it's
of,
got the filmic
yeah.
kind of graininess. Oh, I feel like I'm in Throne of Blood now.
And I mean, the funny thing is, and Austin Walker, the commentator, had said this on Twitter. It looks cool, but actually, and I'm with them. I think it actually is so much better in color.
Yeah.
You know,
Oh, it's a game that I think is just begging to be
yeah,
played in color.
they've done such a lovely job. So I think that's interesting. The other side of it, I will say about the cinematic stuff is that those kind of comments about Kurosawa aside, there's this wonderful moment very, very early in the game where you're taking on the big bad it's the classic video game thing where you're taking on a boss that you're clearly not going to be able to beat, and you'll meet him later. And so he defeats you, and you end up getting knocked off this bridge, and the camera cuts out to this kind of far away view of this small figure, which is you coming down off this very high bridge into the water. And it just looks great, and this kind of willingness to kind of pull back and go for these kind of wide angle shots every chance they get. So far in the game has worked really nicely because the game looks different from other open world kind of games. Mm-hmm. And this looks terrible. I'm not really sure what's going on here.
This is some examples of the Mongol invasion.
Yeah. And I would say that yes, you could argue this kind of serves a specific Japanese reading, which it does, but the Mongols, of course, infamously were horrific and brutal all over the world with this stuff. They were just terrible. I mean, their behavior in China, just to pick an example across the sea from Japan at this point, was absolutely horrific. And what ended up happening was the Mongols kind of realized that taking over the Chinese state structure made sense and was more beneficial in the medium to long term. But prior to that, it was awful. It was scorched earth stuff, and they were doing this all over, East Asia, Central Asia, you name it. So in that sense, this is all. I would have no gripes with them showing the Mongols as being particularly vicious and burning down lots of buildings. But then again, it was the medieval period. It's not like the samurai were sweethearts either. You know,
Sure.
you know.
Well,
So, yeah.
with reference to that, do you get any sense, or what do you make so far of the way they've depicted Japanese culture, Japanese society at this time? I mean, do you feel like it's taking a lot of liberties, or do you think it's something that feels pretty representative of the time period?
I think it. That's a really interesting question. I think it's representative of what, certainly of how it's typically depicted, and what we
Right.
understand it to be, and certainly what many Japanese would like to believe it was. And I say that in the same way that the Irish or Americans and so on would have the same kind of an idea. And like lots of places, the sources are at this particular time period. It's the 13th century. The sources are not ideal. You're getting a specific version of the world from the sources. The sources are enormously elite driven. In fact, pretty much exclusively elitist driven, which again is not unique to Japan, right? In this time period. At the same time, it was a culture where the samurai were succeeding a previous nobility group, had successfully created an entire cultural and political structure that privileged them, and that could be seen in terms of use of language and presentation in public and interpersonal relations and everything else. So I made the comment earlier about them not really approaching class. That's a tricky thing to approach in this time period. So I think as a kind of I certainly could see people being frustrated with the game, not challenging it, but then there's a lot of sources haven't challenged it. Does that make sense? I think you had shared with me, and I must put the link when we do the video into an interview with the co-founder of the developers, and I like the way he talks about it. He openly addresses the reality of this. He's like, listen, for example, the sword is not historically accurate. I mean, in fact,
Right.
the samurai decided to effectively kind of change their sword design after interacting with the Mongols.
Right.
It becomes a much lighter. It becomes the classic katana, whereas prior to this, it was kind of thicker and heavier and everything else. So
More of a broadsword type of thing.
yeah, so I think they've made a. I think what's interesting is they've definitely made compromises and they know it. What kind of intrigues me is what about the times they don't know it, because they're kind of interacting with a narrative that makes sense from a Japanese perspective.
Yes.
And every country has that. I mean, it's not.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
But at the same time, there is kind of an interesting, unique element to the Japanese. For example, I'm not surprised there's much mention of the Koreans, because there's kind of a long-term focus on supposedly monoracial Japanese identity. And that's a whole thing. Sorry to just kind of toss it off like that, but it's a whole thing.
No, it's fine. But it does seem like, like a lot of historical video games, this is a game that is not so much creating its own narrative, but picking up a narrative that's already there. Narrative has a lot of problems. It's not necessarily the game's fault. It's simply replicating a historical narrative that's been in place 700 years or so.
Right, exactly. That's an excellent way to put it. And I think that I would like to see different ways to do it. I would hate to prescribe to the developers this is how you have to make this game, but at the same time, it's a challenge. I mean, it's a difference between reading a relatively popular book based on the samurai and reading the kind of books that you and I read for work, Bob, right? These kind of peer-reviewed things aimed at other professors. Those work well because they embrace complexity.
Yeah.
But would this still be a fun game, and would anybody play it if it was actually that complex?
Exactly.
Which
and,
is,
yeah, and I think, as you've alluded to many times, especially with regards to the absence of Korea in this game, it portrays a history that is black and white in the sense that it's uncomplicated, and that
Right.
you've got a clear antagonist, a clear protagonist, which works really well for a game or novel, television show. But in the world that we work in, we're all about nuance. We're all about difficult topics, complex topics. That's our bread and butter.
Right.
Those type of stories are very difficult for people to wrap their minds. They're difficult for us to wrap our minds around sometimes.
Yeah, and when we're going into it, and if we can't figure it out, we're not going to lose too much sleep over it. It's kind of part of the gig. Whereas, if you go to Tsushima today, for example, and take history tours, it's like taking a tour of the Alamo in the heart of
Yeah,
Texas, right? You're going to get a
yeah,
specific kind of version of it. So, for example, the Mongols show up in 1274, and they approach warfare in a completely different way to the samurai. Now, the idea that the samurai just called out for duels and were used to calling each other out, there's some truth to that. Samurai famously, they
Well,
famously,
I was interested about how you took on this camp instead of
right,
stealthing through it. You simply came up and was like, "Hey,
yeah.
you come out here to fight me."
And the game encourages that, and certainly in samurai culture, they did wear these very bright clothing, and they would have specific emblems, and they would wear trophies and so on. And it was so people knew who you were,
Right.
and so that you could be fighting against the appropriate person. While saying all that, the sources from the time the Japanese side are like, oh well, one of the reasons the Mongols won is the Japanese were trying to take people on duels and stuff. It's like, well, I mean, kind of. The Mongols also won because they grouped up in something akin to a phalanx, and they were using gunpowder bombs, and they were revolutionary as a military
Hmm.
force. In addition to just being like savage fighters on the individual level, they forced the samurai as a kind of a fighting class, at least in the southwest of Japan, to re-examine how they fought. And so, from a military history perspective, it's just this fascinating example of the samurai, adapting, and that's
Right.
interesting. And I think it's clearly interesting, but it's not quite as romantic as the Japanese, and as outnumbered Japanese samurai somehow holding off the greatest fighting force that had existed in humanity up to that period, which
Yeah,
is,
like a lot of nationalized myths, there's not really much room for instances in which the enemy inspires change in the national story. Right now, it's like
right, exactly.
there's not a lot of space for that typically.
What I will
Whether it's
say,
Japan or America or Texas with the Alamo.
what exactly, and what I would say though, I think that one of the things I think they've done really well, whatever way they've done it, they've kind of accepted, they've gathered a theme, they've gathered like the feelings of how these histories are told. And
Hmm.
I think they understand that romance is part of it. So look at this. You see his right hand is opening a little bit as he walks through the field here.
Hmm.
This nice little moment that he's kind of enjoying nature. This was always, maybe in fact it was certainly often very idealized, but there was always the sense that the samurai, although they were fighting warriors, were something more than that. That they were literate, they were scholarly, but they also appreciated beauty, and that appreciation was important, and that they were looking for something, that fulfillment was important as well. And maybe that's exaggerated, maybe it's not, but the game is participating in that kind of a dialogue in a way that makes sense to me. And it doesn't feel, how do I put it? The underlying idea of the samurai being glorified might be troubling, and that, like, well, this feels kind of one dimensional. I don't think the game's representation of it is one dimensional. Outside
Hmm.
of some kind of heavy handed, you know, this is what honor is type stuff that's been going on. But hopefully, I'll play some more of the game before the full episode, and I'll learn a bit more about that. We'll
One thing
see.
I wanted to mention really fast is that I really like the fact that there isn't much of a HUD for this game, and so
Right.
you really get a great look at the game, the beauty of the game, and you feel. I mean, I'm not playing it right now, but you feel really attached to the
Yeah.
surroundings in a way that even though it is gamified, in the sense that you just collected that flower without actually touching
Right.
it,
Yes, exactly.
that you do really feel close to this environment. You feel a part of it, and I think that it's a good choice. I think A lot of the best open world games are now kind of taking that approach.
I think what impresses me, and I'm not somebody who would usually turn off the HUD when he plays a game. Some people like to do that. I don't, but it's worked beautifully for me. And what's impressive to me, so here it goes again. Look, this is the most hilariously not natural thing ever. You know, like it's like, you know, a Far Cry style. You're playing a game. What's impressive to me is it doesn't massively disrupt that sense of kind of I'm in this game world. It's quite. Oh, I missed my chance to sugar.
Oh no.
Ah, well, you see. I know the game wants me to parry, but I'm a dodger. It's who I am. You see, there's one.
Ooh. Oh,
That was a
hey,
good one. There
you
we go. You see?
You did it.
I did it. Look at me. So yeah, so no, so it's good. I'm looking forward to playing some more for the full episode. And you know, people who are watching, again, I think with the caveats we've been discussing in terms of how history is in games and everything, it's funny. I always feel like I'm repeating myself in History Respawn because you know, they've had to make decisions. And I think if you did approach it as this is an attempt to kind of recreate a storyteller friendly version of Japanese samurai history, which is exactly what it is, I think you'll enjoy it. And as a game, it works really nicely and really well. And they've done such a lovely job creating this world. It's really, really impressive. It's really impressive.
Awesome. Well, I'll look forward to the full episode later on, and thanks for having me on.
No, it's always great, Bob. It's fun. It's a fun game to play. I'm looking forward to it. Thanks everyone for watching. We hope you enjoyed the chat. As always, please feel free to visit us at historyrespawn.com. And if you'd like to support our work, you can do that at patreon.com/historyrespawn. Keep an eye on the website or the YouTube channel for the full episode for Ghost of Tsushima. Thanks everybody. Take care.